poll, just 6% of teachers positive about Ofsted proposals. A poll showed the recent poll indicating the proposed reforms is a clear signal that these changes may not align with the needs and expectations of educators. I know certainly that's not that chimes with my feeling about what's going on. In my experience, effective reform in education hinges on meaningful consultation with those on the front lines, and our teachers and school leaders will want to put into those changes. Without their buy-in, even well-intentioned initiatives will falter. It won't work if those people are not engaged in the process. And there are some that are saying that Ofsted reviewing Ofsted was not the wisest move. These people are educationalists and they are involved in the system, but is it doing what we need it to do? The introduction of report cards assessing schools across multiple areas aims to provide a more nuanced evaluation. That's definitely certain. However, if these tools are perceived as additional layers of bureaucracy rather than supportive measures, they risk exacerbating the existing pressures that the review was intending to resolve. It's crucial that any new framework not only upholds the standards, but also genuinely supports educators in their mission to provide quality education. At SMARTcurriculum, we've seen firsthand the importance of collaborative approaches and being involved with educators in development of assessment tools. By engaging teachers in the process, we can create systems that are both rigorous and supportive and meet their needs and do what is required of the system, ultimately leading to improved outcomes for students. That's always going to be what we're here to achieve, and being smarter with it is what SMARTcurriculum is all about. Moving forward, it's imperative that Ofsted actively listens to the concerns of educators and works collaboratively to refine these proposals. Only through genuine partnership, I believe, can we develop an inspection framework that is both effective and embraced by all those it aims to serve. How can we ensure the future reforms are developed in true collaboration with educators to meet the needs of the diverse needs of our schools? Well, let's have a look at 10 questions that might be worth asking. What changes would you like to see in Ofsted's approach to inspections to better support both schools and teachers? I mean, that is a classic start point, and I think perhaps that's where we should have been right at the beginning of this review. How can we ensure that educators' perspectives are prioritised in the development of policies and the inspection framework? Well, there's a tiering there. Where does the teacher and educator opinion come relative to the political framework? And is it that politics and the political position has trumped the position of the educators? That's a question to answer. What initiatives have you implemented in your school to reduce the pressure associated with inspections and accountability measures? I hear lots of school leaders, trying to take the pressure off people, particularly when the phone call comes. We're in the days of, the days of spending hours at the photocopier producing lots of paper that are then not actually viewed by inspectors. I know examples where schools were actually roundly criticised for the amount of paper they'd wasted in that process, all for great intentions. It was all for the right reason, but we wanted to show ourselves well. Maybe and actually inspection, and the whole point of those no notice inspections is that you wouldn't have the opportunity to spend all of that time and money printing loads of papers for little impact. Now that the no notice inspections added their own pressure, and that was soon taken away because it wasn't felt that was going to be as productive as it was intended. We all have this understanding of the law of unintended consequences. And we've seen this with the inspection framework all the way through. I would actually go to a little bit further. What was the inspection framework there for in the first place? It was to ensure that national curriculum was to be found in all of the schools. It's interesting that the correlation between that and the Academies Act, which actually gave academies 5 freedoms, which included not having to deliver the national curriculum. So this education policy has not necessarily followed through with the acts of parliament. So we've got this little bit of confusion. What Ofsted was there for in the first place back in the 1990s, and then we'd got into the 2000s, the noughties, where we have the freedoms came into being. So this is the question: what has been your experience with the reforms that have introduced without sufficient consultation, but also the synergy of what they were trying to achieve? One act of parliament building on another act of parliament, and education reform has struggled with that journey. So we can ask the question, but actually it's a question we need to ask of the Select Committee and the Secretary of State in terms of what they've been trying to do. And I know that there's a lot of myth and legend around the Secretary of State and the ministerial team, in the sense of it's a very difficult job to do, to turn this big ship around. It's an 80-90 billion pound resource in our country. And how is that education policy and education reforms really being enacted within our system? And what is it doing? It's impacting teacher retention. And what role does a fair and supportive assessment of the system play in improving teacher retention and morale? I listening the other day to Ross McGill talking about this. We need to separate these two, because clearly in the system we talk about teacher retention and teacher recruitment. They are two different things. We seem to be getting people into the system. Certainly the data from the DfE website, the workforce data, tells us that the number of people that are in the system are greater now than they were, but we are not keeping them for lengths of time. So retention is a different question to recruitment. Now, that's not to say that we are recruiting the people in the right subjects, because that is a concern, but we need to see that we retain those people. Now, I left teaching 15 years ago as a full-time job, and I've been working with schools in SMARTcurriculum since then, after a 25-year career. Now, that's unusual these days for people to be in the system for that long. So how do we retain people to become leaders? I recorded with Andrew Chubb, who'd again been through the system and got to CEO of the Bishop Centremew Trust in Hull, and he's, after a lifetime, people that have been in the system for that long are becoming rarer and rarer. And all credit to those of you that have been in the system for longer than me. I valued it as a career, and certainly after 40 years, in the mid 80s when I started, it's been a rewarding career, but concerning that there are people that are not staying in it for that long. And so moving on, what innovation strategies have you implemented to improve school performance without adding administrative burdens? I remember going into a school as a head of department, looking to help the department and make an impact. And we did some work on reporting systems and data gathering systems way back in the 1990s. And I remember my team being so grateful for the impact of those strategies that we put in place for a big team. I had 22 in a department team, but we concentrated on data gathering and reporting systems, and we automated them using Excel and Word and so on. But those systems back then impacted their work, because we got rid of the old checkbook reports where one person wrote on a report and then passed it on to the next person. And you know what happens? You make a mistake, you make a spelling mistake or an error or miswrote something, and you had to go back to the beginning. And it was a crazy system. I mean, it was what we knew, it's what we had, but we automated that process and made it. And it was at the time innovative. As far as I was aware, no one else was doing something in that field, but we did it because it helped the members of staff to decrease their administrative burden. Now we have AI and we have lots of other tools and techniques to do that, and that's why we champion smart curriculum analytics, because it's taking the burden away from spreadsheet based activity. Next, how do we ensure that curriculum and strategic goals remain adaptable while meeting inspection accountability requirements? I mean, that's the adaptability. I would suggest this thing about adaptability is still very loaded on the teacher, because we talk about adaptive teaching. And in our work at Smart Curriculum, we've been talking about adaptive curriculum. I asked that question: is one shape and one size appropriate for all? It clearly isn't, because if it was the case that it worked, we would not have SEND provision and we would not have alternative provisions. Clearly, we are in a position where one size, one shape is not right for everybody. But we still have in most schools, most secondary schools, one shape of curriculum for everybody. And if you don't fit, then we need to provide an alternative or a special provision. Now, that is where I would suggest in the system, there's probably £10 billion worth of concern. And because everything at the moment that isn't in that shape is an additionality. That additionality is costing money. And if you understand the funding system, it comes from the notional fund at the start point. Well, that notional fund is not additional money. It actually comes from the GAG. So if your GAG is paying for a curriculum and you need to provide out everything else, that's £6,000 a child that is in that notional funding. That's where that money is coming from. So, you know, this whole question about curriculum planning and the challenges that it's bringing, you know, I know I'm relating this back to Ofsted, but there's all of these expectations of what we need to see. You know, I remember back to the school I worked with that had 50% of the year group with English as an alternative language as one of their big concerns. So they'd created the curriculum and then created 50% extra to deliver classes. And the question I asked them was, how are you getting on with classes that are half full? Because you're taking half the children out to provide this extra bit. And no one had asked them the question, and it suddenly dawned on them, wow, well, if we changed the curriculum provision, we could meet their needs in a different way, and it wouldn't all be additionality. Now, again, I'm always going to come back to that question of curriculum planning. But again, we come back to this. The expectations of inspection are to find something of a common format. What advice would you offer policymakers to ensure that the future education reforms address the real challenges faced by teachers and school leaders? I find a lot of what we come across within the system is an assumed expectation. We assume what it's going to look like because we have all been through the system and we expect it to look as we think it's going to be. Now, with the rise in SEN, EHCPs, you know, or this is a response to children that are not fitting in that expected form. Well, if what you're expecting to see is not innovative and is not based on response to need, we are not going to be changing as we move forward, because it looks different. Now, you know, I'm probably not thanked for saying this, and I know that there were flaws within the RSA opening minds approach, but it was different. It was the free schools that have tried things that are very different. Those didn't fit the model of the inspection framework because it was different to beyond the norm. Now, rather than supporting that process to do something different, a lot of those systems have just stopped because they didn't meet the requirements of the inspection framework. Well, does that mean that the inspection framework was wrong in the first place? Does it mean that there were flaws in the ideas and the innovation that were being tried? Well, maybe both. But it certainly has responded with favour to one rather than the other. And that leaves us with this question. What advice would you give to policymakers to ensure that future education reforms address the real challenges faced by the teachers and the children and the communities, rather than simply having this structure that demands compliance rather than innovation?